Get your scars, how a star is born here in Stranglethorn.
Hello everyone and welcome to If Older Expansions Were Released in 2023. Today we are going to be discussing Rastakhan's Rumble, and this is probably the peak content that you could probably experience from this series. Why? Because Rastakhan's Rumble is known for very unique cards, kind of shifts in the meta per se, but also what led to one of the weakest expansions that have impacted us over the course of a standard set period. It had a lot of cool things going for it, and unfortunately it did not just hit too well because Blizzard's Hearthstone team wanted to try and utilize reeling back on the power creep, and which, to we know today, failed miserably, and the cards now have been nothing but a power creep powerhouse. So this episode is very important because we get to see what types of buffs could be playable in today's term. And now, mind you, it is going to be quite hard. I'm still going to stay within theme. I'm going to try to included is some buffs and reworks, and then of course know that this is my own opinion that I have adjusted, designed for wild and twist, but more importantly in a standard format nowadays. And last thing I would like to point out is nowhere in this video will you ever see the Loa cards. Those are the stealth for one turn, have a type of effect minion. I won't be including those because that will be for a different video. It is a complete redesign that needs to occur. So just keep in mind, if you're like, hey, where are these cards? They're not here, but they will be another video describing how we can go about improving them. And lastly, if you guys like the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. And also let me know in the comments below what you guys think of the buffs. And what other cards you think should be buffed in the expansion set. Alright, so starting us off is Druid, and I kind of focused on this big beast archetype that they were clearly going for. Now there are other cards you could probably buff. Again, Rastakhan's Rumble has a huge amount of cards that could be buffed. But I still wanted to stay within theme and just kind of keep it compact to show you how big of a buff we're talking about. So at the top here, we're looking at Predatory Instincts, a huge buff going in. Basically cutting the cost by half from 4 mana to 2 mana. It's very unique because it draws a beast specifically and you double its health. In my opinion, this still is a bit on the weaker side, as Warrior has something kind of like this that draws a taunt minion and then Mana Thirst. It gives double the stats to it. There is no requirement on waiting for the Mana Thirst on the double the health, so it's a little bit worthwhile just to play it exactly on 2 mana, drawing a card, doubling its stats. I mean, even getting this on a 4 cost minion like a 4 mana 3/5 taunt. There are some beasts that are like that for Druid. So it's very feasible on turn 4 you could play a 4 mana 3/10. Is it as worthwhile? Possibly. But it does definitely amp it up, and it kind of combines everything all together, which is our next card, Ironhide Direhorn. Now that is a 7 mana 7/7. What I included in it, very simple change. I don't normally like to include it because it is a little bit of a design issue. Usually including Rush is not a great opportunity to include in cards because it's like, hey, like any card could be good with Rush, right? But I think this kind of fits simply because of the next card next to it, Stampeding Roar. So it used to be a 6 mana, summon a random beast from your hand and give it Rush. Well, it doesn't make sense because the entire goal of what they were trying to do is, oh, you summon Ironhide Direhorn, oh, now you give it Rush, so now it can use its overkill. Well, Ironhide Direhorn now has Rush. To circumvent that practically would be to instead make it attack a random enemy minion. You could probably go as far, maybe to even adjust it to a the lowest health enemy minion if you wanted to. But it attacks a random enemy minion for the Direhorn, and then now we'll summon a 5/5 Ironhide run. Chances are you're probably going to be proccing the overkill. And then on top of that, it still has Rush, so it should also be able to attack into something else. giving you the effect of practically utilizing it as best as possible. This entire beast series is kind of nice, and I really hope that they try to go with something like this if they do go further into a buff aspect in Rastakhan's Rumble. It's quite a ways away. We just are hitting the Un'Goro sets, right? So like maybe quite some time before we see any of it, but it is still a really cool concept for a expansion that is released possibly as one of the weakest expansions. Overall, cool card set. I do like this beast synergy, and this is what I primarily wanted to focus with. Next up is Hunter. A lot of changes here. The main core target is to beasts, but also some cards that we do know and love from that series of the expansion, and that is Baited Arrow. 5 mana, deal 5. Overkill, summon a 5/5 Devilsaur. So I've changed the damage from 3 to 5, almost increasing it, I believe, by over a little bit. I think it's probably more like 40%. But the reasoning for this is you could sure make this a 4 mana type of effect, but it's very similar to the one that summons a 3/3 Wolf. It doesn't give its own type of uniqueness. So I'm like, hey, sometimes hunters have always had this meme or this kind of luxury that, oh, well, Baited Arrow can go face, so I could deal 3 to face if I really needed to. I remember those being some sort of jokes because chances were very slim, but yes, it did allow you to do that. Well, now it's not as bad doing it, and more importantly is you can summon the 5/5 Devilsaur quite easier now with 5 damage. There is no longer a 2 health threshold. Practically all bars are a little bit put aside. Of course, you can't kill a big minion with it, but you could definitely plan for it throughout the course. And so I think it's really nice. I do think it would, in a standard format, something like this could be seen as play. It just really does depend. And now this might be a little bit of an overstep, but I did increase the Headhunter's Hatchet buff, going from the gaining +1 durability to +2 durability. So instead of it being a 2/3, which technically is kind of standard format to nowadays power level terms, due to them buffing Fiery War Axe, or should I say reverting Fiery War Axe back to a 2 mana card. And so now instead, because this is a conditional card, I thought it would be more worthwhile to make it a 2 mana 2/4 weapon. And very strong, it very much is indeed. But this card is actually currently in standard and has not seen very much play, even when the Shock Spitters were included, which of course you would want to attack as many times as possible. It was overpowered by other weapon cards that were included, and so therefore I think because we've actually seen what it could do in standard, how much it's included, could deserve a buff nonetheless. And a 2 mana 2/4 is much better than a 2 mana 2/3 weapon. Extra damage, I think it's quite nice. Now, Master's Call is also a callback in a Blast of the Past, and I think this was kind of a nice fit because it included an all beast, or it encouraged an all beast hunter deck archetype. And back then, 3 mana draw 3 was quite insane, and they would definitely build their deck around it. It was very niche, it fit into a category, and at the time it kind of fulfilled all those opportunities. I personally think the hunters that we know now aren't nothing like this, and I would like to see kind of like a blast for that. And in today's term, a conditional, having your deck with nothing but beasts, although yes, hunter does fill with beasts, the condition fits quite nicely. So I can definitely imagine a 2 mana draw 3 over the course of it. And if not, I mean, you can still include it in other decks and it doesn't feel as bad to play. And on the off chance you do get 3 beasts, it's not the end of the world, is basically what I'm saying. You're not playing a 3 mana discover a minion. So lessens the harshness if you are putting it or discovering it in just a regular hunter deck that has a mix of other archetypes, other beast tribes or other tribes of minions. And then much stronger now if you are encouraging to play it. So it's kind of an all-around type thing. I personally like it. I would include it in my deck, and this is quite nice. I do think this is great. These are all great cards that I have seen back in Rastakhan's Rumble, and although I do hate Hunter, I'm not gonna lie, these cards are very reminiscent. All right, Mage. Mage is quite interesting because there is a lot of different routes you can go with them. One of the ways that I wanted to go with is actually go with the elemental synergy. And again, this might be me with my bias. If you guys haven't seen my previous videos, every single time there is an elemental mage archetype that is trying to be pushed and failed, I will try to buff those. And it may be troll, I may be trolling completely, but I really want Elemental Mage to work out. That's just my wholehearted opinion. Arcanosaur, instead of damaging all minions, you're damaging all enemy minions. Now, I like to say that you could possibly buff this a little bit more, maybe to deal 4 damage, or maybe up the Arcanosaur to a better stat line. But dealing damage to specifically enemies is very specific, and it's quite a drastic change, although it doesn't seem so, because now you could basically play this without having to play around it too much. And I think this is the safer option. Now, if you wanted to go more, you could go more, but I do think shifting it into this targeting only enemies is the best way to go, especially when you're considering that, you know, it's an archetype that isn't really as strong, and it kind of goes against what elemental mage wants to do, which is flood the board with elementals, play minions. And this card, by design, at its current state, kind of negates that. So shifting it to enemy minions is a hopeful push to make it a bit more playable and more synergizing with other cards that are introduced. And then we have Scorch. Now, I think this is a fair and valid buff. Damage from 4 to 6, so instead it deals 6 damage to a minion. Even at playing at 4 mana, it's not too bad, but if you are playing it, it is a 1 mana cost. And in my opinion, I think this is quite nice. Shaman has something like this that is a 5 mana, lifesteal, deals 6 damage to a minion. With, if you're overloaded, you get to have it at 2 mana. Kind of around the same aspect. This one might be a bit harder to trigger, but the goal of it is that if that card is played and has that kind of benefit for a condition, well, this should also kind of fall into the same page. And it doesn't have lifesteal, so of course, you know, valid that it does cost 1 less than the Shaman variant that is current in standard. Overall, these two are the elemental packages here. I think they are quite nice. One extra thing I would like to add is that I did include Blast Wave, which is a bit on the stronger end. So if you haven't been seeing a key pattern, I am trying to increase the power level of the overkill minions. I feel like, similar to things like Honorable Kill or Frenzy, Overkill was also one of those keywords that got overvalued. And so they definitely toned down the card power level, and especially in Rastakhan's Rumble, because they were already toning it down as is. They toned it down even further for the overkill cards. I'm saying a lot of the overkill cards really are not that great, and I cannot think of a single card that is played currently today. If there is, please let me know in the comments, because I would like to know. But the interesting part with Blast Wave is that I personally use it quite a bit, and the way I used it was more of like a combo activator. I play something like Thalnos to give the +1 spell damage, and then Blast Wave, and then I get extra. I basically fill my hand with random mage spells. Well, it's quite nice, and I do think that is a route you probably want to go with, and I honestly think that's even the route that they were probably intending with it. So I wanted to encourage that and kind of make it a bit cheaper to play. You know, dealing 3 damage to all minions is really like a 2.5 mana effect. There are cards at 2 mana that deal 2 damage to all minions. And then the overkill effect, again, is variant, but the key importance here is that I could increase the damage, but it would just make it too easy to accomplish that overkill, and therefore kind of ruining the point. So I wanted to just lower the mana curve just so you can combo it with certain things. Thalnos is one. If not, 4 mana deal 2 damage isn't the worst, but it still is on the weaker end, in hopes that you probably get some cards to kind of circumvent that. Maybe not the best card. It could probably be buffed a little bit more, but I do think lowering the mana curve is a lot better. Hell, I would even probably put it at 3 mana just to basically make it playable. It might be too much So I think putting at 4 is definitely a safe play. Next up is Paladin. Now, Paladin has all these cool tactics that I have made, and a lot of it is focused towards a restoration or healing Paladin. And man, I honestly think I would like to see something like this again. We've kind of seen some variants like Carrier Rome. It was more of like a hand buff tanky situation, which is really cool. You utilize a lot of your healing spells became a lot more impactful. I do want to see that again. I just think there could be a different approach to what it is. And a new challenger is kind of one of those cards that I wanted to buff. The only thing I added to it was giving the discovered minion a lifesteal tag. So now it has lifesteal, and it becomes a bit more of an inclusion in a control archetype, because if you're on the lower end, well, now it's not just a taunt divine shield that maybe they could just trade minions, no worries, you know, wipe their hands clean of slate. You're summoning a 6 cost minion now, and it could potentially heal you for twice. And depending on the type of minion you're discovering, maybe you get a death rattle that deals damage to certain things, or, you know, hits their face. Like, there's probably a bunch of different 6 cost minions that can do that by chance. And I think this is a completely invalid buff, because the Amanthul actually has this exact effect right here, and it's quite strong at an 8 mana cost. In my opinion, I think this is very valid and still a little bit on the weaker end, but you know, you could definitely see something like this on that terms of aspect. So, you know, I think it's a great step in the right direction. It definitely would help encourage you to restore more health. And that's leading on to the next card, Zandalari Templar, which actually requires you to heal a certain amount per game. So what I have done is I've kind of shifted things around a bit. What I've done is basically it used to read a battle cry: if you restore 10 health this game, gain +4/+4 and taunt. Well, now I made taunt a permanent keyword, and which you can see at the top there, and instead included divine shield as the condition effect. So now it's a 4 mana 4/4 taunt. You could play it, sure, but if you happen to restore 10 health this game, you give it +4/+4 like normal, but now you give it divine shield, which makes it a bit trickier for your opponent to deal with, because it's not just a simple minion that they have to hit. They definitely have to hit at least 2 minions, maybe do something specific to clear it. So it's just to keep that survivability. And as you're seeing it as a kind of like, as you're seeing the inclusion of this healing is also including a lot of the divine shield lifesteal combos. So that's kind of the direction I've taken it. And then I have also buffed Faraki Battle Axe. And this is actually quite a big buff. I do agree. But again, a lot of the overkill cards I would like to overbuff, because they definitely do deserve it. And again, they were very undervalued, and I think that they can still be saved. This might be a saved keyword archetype with the help of some balance changes. And 4 mana 3/3 weapon, I have come to the conclusion that, and it seems that Blizzard can also agree too, is that 4 mana 3/3 is a safe and sweet spot for a weapon to kind of exist. It's enough to create a decent amount of damage while also having a moderate effect. I mean, when we look at Warrior, they have 2 4 mana 3/3 weapons, and they have both excelled quite nice in their times. 4 mana 3/3 draw card when you kill a minion, that's seen play throughout its entire time. And then also 4 mana 3/3 gain 4 armor. It's also another thing that's kind of just become quite a uniqueness. Needless to say, the 4 mana 3/3 aspect I personally have come to a liking to when it comes to a 4 mana weapon. So if it's usually anywhere between a 5 mana weapon, it may not cut it. And so probably bringing it down to 4 mana really can up and change the direction and kind of pivot it to like a kind of accelerated play rate, in my opinion. Yeah, at worst, the 4 mana 3/3 weapon. And so the overkill also has gotten buffed, in addition to that, it's not just the 4 mana, nerf down, or it's not just the 4 mana buff. So what basically is occurring is it's a 4 mana 3/3 overkill, give a minion in your hand +3/+3. And I think that's quite nice. You can get this easier on a 4. Chances are there are going to be minions that will be able to kind of trigger the overkill, and then giving a minion +3/+3 over the course of 3 turns is much better. It's a +3/+3 overall for the entire effects. And I do definitely think that this is something that really pivots Paladin in Rastakhan in a very bright way and very aggressive, while also having and maintaining some sort of control tools. Now, Priest gets kind of the short end of the stick, because I do think Priest generally has decent cards. And that's not to say there's not cards that can't be buffed, but their kind of archetype philosophy was designed a lot on their Loa, and therefore kind of had certain things going around with it. But I didn't want to go and push too further. And this is kind of a shame, because I feel like lately, the past couple expansions, Priest has been doing well, but it's because Priest does so well in general now. Like, I don't know if this is something that's absolutely necessary, but one of the things that I personally loved and was completely let down by its power level is Princess Talanji. And playing Princess Talanji made me come to the realization that just because you can fill your board does not mean you will win the game. And so therefore I do think that emptying your entire hand to fill your board is not worthy of effect at 8 mana. And so I wanted to kind of push it into summon copies of the generated minions you have instead. And I do personally think this is fine. You're going to be summoning them. They have a lot of value. She should provide a lot of value considering you've worked up so much to have it. And hell, I mean, if this even becomes too problematic or maybe not worthy in design or balance philosophy, I do think it's right where it should be. And if you have to increase it by a mana or 2, I do think this is the type of direction it should go, because summoning copies would be really cool. Am I right? Okay, Rogue. So Rogue here, there's quite a bit of pirate stuff that goes down, and I did not want to touch that for the most part. The only Rogue card that I did touch was Captain Hooktusk, and that's because she is more of a later game pirate. Not many pirates would be included with... She wouldn't be included in many pirate decks because of that fact. I mean, we could see that with Captain Hooktusk before, and then also, the current pirates legendary that we have, that if you summon X amount of pirates, you get this like unique effect. It's too slow for Rogue. So instead, I just kind of wanted to give this push that maybe they can play Pirate Rogue on a different type of scale that's not as aggressive, or that doesn't have that extra push. And if they happen to need this in the later game, I could be making a mistake. But it's so cool. Like, I do like this a late game, mid to late game Captain Hooktusk type of effect, where pirates get, over benefit for just getting into the late game. And I really want to see this kind of in a play action. Now, is it good? Is it not? Who knows? But it's a very fitting buff that might be overpowered. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if I'm stepping the line or boundary. What card I do think should be buffed, and very valid, is Walk the Plank. Because before, it was 4 mana, and it was like, okay, destroy an undamaged minion. You're saving yourself the mana for destroying a minion, because the standard core set, the classic destroy minion, was 5 mana for the longest time from what we've known. Well, now got buffed to 4 mana, so now this card is like, well, why would I do this when I can just play the 4 mana destroy minion? And so it makes sense to me to reduce this down to 3. It's kind of a sweet spot. It's very similar to destroy a damaged minion, but this has to be undamaged, and in my opinion, that is a little bit harder to trigger. So therefore, 3 mana is the sweet spot of where it should be. You could probably go to, say, 2 mana But nonetheless, I do think that it should still be 3 as a baseline and then kind of go from there. And now Grawl is kind of a semi-rework kind of deal. Basically what's happening is that if you guys don't know what his effect is, it used to read, Battlecry, eat a minion in your deck and gain its stats. And then Death Rattle, add it to your hand. So basically you pull Ragnaros, you get +8/+8 on this guy. This guy dies, it becomes a 10/10. This guy dies, and then you get Ragnaros back to your hand. Kind of like a weird draw type of effect, while also playing a semi-big oriented minion. And I wanted to kind of buff this because, you know, that alone was never really good. A 5 mana that gives you, on average, probably about +3/+3 to +5/+5, like around that type of buff era, because Rogue doesn't really have a lot of like high statted minions. I mean, we just looked at Captain Hook there, that's a 8 cost minion that I buffed to 6/6, so like at best you could have something like that and it wouldn't be as impactful. So instead, I thought it'd be best to actually make it eat 2 minions from your deck, gain their stats, and then add both to your hand. Yes, it still is subject to silence, maybe some other type of archetypes that can kind of do some weird stuff, shuffling and stuff. That always will exist. But the fact that you get to, I mean, one, thin your deck out. This kind of can be a deck thinner, if you want to think about it. It gains double the stats and adds double the cards to your hand. So the payoff is really huge. And if your opponent doesn't have a sort of silence or anything to deal with this, well, it's going to be a huge problem for them. Is it too much? Possibly. It could be a little bit more on the stronger side, because I basically did just increase the effect by double. And yeah, I mean, it may be too strong, but I do think this is where it should be. And if it became too much, you could just nerf it from this state, and I think it would be quite fine. You can make it at 7 or 8 mana, and it would be, you know, semi-nice. I do think this is the direction it should be going. And it's a shark. You could see it just have that little chomp on your deck, another chomp there, and then the buff stats. I think it's quite fitting. And I don't think this is actually quite strong as people would probably think it is. But it is a good direction to go to do what Rogue loves to do, which is add some value generation. And Grawl the Shark does it in a very unique way. Okay, Shaman. Next up here is the quite big buffs, to be honest. I think these are very moderate buffs, but very, very necessary. Big Bad Voodoo, first of all, is getting its evolve from 1 cost more to 2 cost more. Very simple change. Reasoning for this change is that why would you do this when you can just buff all your minions by 1, you know, across the board for 1 mana? Just a simple evolve effect. And I think this is a baseline, and if you ask me, I personally think this could possibly even be summoning a random minion that costs 3 more. That could just be me. I went with more of the safer play, as you know, generating this is probably more valuable now. It's basically double the effect, and it's more so to see where it lands and how that fits. Evolve effects are very scary because it is very high rolly, and so I didn't want to put it at 3 mana I didn't want to put it at it costing 3 more to kind of create this problematic experience that maybe doesn't fit quite well into what was intended. What I do think is quite necessary, though, is a big buff to Reign of Toads. It used to be a 6 mana summon 3/2/4 Toads with Taunt and Overload 3. Like, wow, this was insane. This actually would costed you 9 mana to summon. And I tried to get a good comparison on what card was fitting, and there is a Druid 6 mana spell that has tradable and summons 2/2/7 turtles. And those cards do pretty fine. I mean, that doesn't even see play. So I figured, okay, 6 mana summon 4/14 in stats for 6 without an overload and the option to trade. You know, that's a good baseline to kind of get. And that's kind of where I base my balance on. Reign of Toads, summoning 3/2/4 toads with taunt, overload 2. So you're paying 7 mana for 6/12 in stats. About the same. It's truthfully still 1 cost more, and it might be still too much. That's how to say that some of the cards at their initial effects are just outrageous in Rastakhans. I mean, this was played at 9 mana, and I just reduced it by 2 mana, and it still isn't comparable to some of the cards that were just recently in Standard a couple years ago. But I do give it the benefit of the doubt that Overload is a useful mechanic and that can be used that way. This is kind of to help push it without kind of harming it so much. And I do love the direction that Blizzard is going with using Overload as an activator and not so much as a, oh, I play cheap card for big effect and I pay for it later. It's not that strong and it's not that impactful, and frankly it's just kind of a little bit on the weaker end in today's terms. 4 mana 7/7 ain't gonna cut it anymore. All right, Warlock. So, man, Warlock was quite tough to kind of balance, but I did like to include different types of things. So one of the things I wanted is High Reek, and I could not think of a better opportunity to do this, which is include Rush and Lifesteal, because of the fact it's a bat, has Rush, and it's very vampiric, which gives it Lifesteal. At its current state, it heals for 7, deals for 7. If you buff it by +1/+1, it deals 14 and it heals 14. You see where I'm going here. It's basically a huge arena type deck that kind of activates and makes it a little bit stronger. I think it's to encourage the fact that maybe this isn't used in a, like, there should be some big payoff with it, and the direction is that this will not win you if you flood the board, so you have to find other means to kind of make it useful. And adding Rush and Lifesteal, again, very fitting to the card and also to the class, to kind of get you the type of payoff that you're kind of building with the deck. If you're playing this at +3/+3 and it's, you know, summoning a batch of 4/4s, you should be able to heal off of all of them or trade into all of them, and not kind of like, okay, I flood my board, your turn. Like, that should not exist. So I think having some interactivity, especially with something like a bat, would be much more useful. Now, if it was a different class or maybe a different legendary, I would not include this, but I think it's quite fitting for something like this. Next card is Demon Bolt, and I think this is kind of the direction I wanted to take it. If you guys don't know, the previous card is 8 mana, Demon Bolt, destroy minion, it costs 1 less for each minion you control. So if you have 7 minions on the board, it costs 1. It's kind of hard to make 7 minions. This was kind of around the time when, like, they were trying to do this High Reek, flood the board, and then you also have this Demon Bolt. But it was kind of hard to kind of really get an interaction with it to really become useful. With the standard destroy minion costing 4 mana, having such a huge downside for it isn't as impactful. And so instead, I wanted to make it to where if you have a certain amount of minions, well, it's the same. And upped the cost reduction from 1 to 2. And up the mana to 10 mana for the adjusted balance, because not only do you need only 5 minions to make it cost 0, it becomes a lot better after you have your 2 minions. At 2 minions, it's the same. At 3 minions, it becomes a 4 mana destroy minion. It's possible that it might be too weak, but I did not see it very fitting at 8 mana. So it really does depend. Again, Warlock is a very iffy class. A lot of it was dealt with a token-oriented style deck that just kind of just didn't really fit at all without it becoming absolutely broken. And I mean absolutely broken. There are some cards there that I'm sure, as we know, OTK Mark has made some sort of video where you can OTK your opponent with a 7 mana 5/8 and deal 2 damage to the enemy hero for each minion died. It's happened. I've seen the video. So it's a bit problematic. I didn't want to kind of encourage that and therefore went light on Warlock. So as you're seeing here, these are cards that are not really the target that I would like to go with. But again, with the Loas, I did want to change him. So again, be on the lookout for when I make that video because that will be an interesting one. Next up actually is an interesting take, and I was rather enjoying this. Warrior, and the goal set is dragons. So Battlecry, if you're holding a dragon, gain damage. So Battlecry, if you're holding a dragon, destroy a damaged enemy minion. It was quite a good card for its time. I wanted to make it better. I think bringing this back in the spotlight, sometimes cards just need to be brought back in the spotlight to show them, hey, this card existed, and if you reprint this, sure, like as a +1/+1, it's fine, but bring it back. Like it was nothing wrong with it. It encouraged a type of archetype and pushed for it, and I do definitely think that, you know, you could have some form of changes to it. And so I made it just a standard 3 mana 4/3. You play this as 3 mana 4/3, it's whatever. The destroy a damage enemy minion is the extra 1 mana effect taxed onto it, and I think it's perfectly fine. It's very, very strong, very, very aggressive, but I think that is exactly what this Rastakhan's Rumble does definitely need. I mean, look at them. Does that scream a 3 mana 3/2? That's at least a 3 mana 4/3 right there. And then to the right of it is Emberscale Drake. Probably more of a lesser effect, but I couldn't really think of anything else to really make it more meshed besides make it even a better version. So there's a 5 mana 5/5 out there that gives you 5 armor with no limitation. It used to be 6 mana, they buffed it to 5 mana, and then Emberscale Drake just became the well, what about me? And Blizzard was like, what about you? Like, you're a dragon, what are you talking about? Well, that's not fair, so I did want to give it just a slight push, again with the dragon archetype that it should deserve. And gaining 8 armor with a requirement, I think it's again about a 2 to 3 mana effect taxed onto a condition on a 5 mana minion. I think that's perfectly fine. So therefore, kind of pushes this control dragon archetype. Again, gaining more armor than you normally usually would, destroying a damaged enemy minion at a very cost effective while kind of having a very aggressive archetype. Kind of helps push Warrior in a good route, and I personally am a fan of Dragon Warrior, so there is that. But needless to say, I do think these are some good changes. Okay, but that is not it. So I have done quite a bit of changes to neutrals, and some of these will actually be for arena and some will be as a set standard. And what I mean by that is that Fire Tree Witch Doctor, for example, at the top left there, is a big change, and it's going from a 2 mana 2/2 to a 1 mana 2/1. And the reasoning for this is, well, the push for dragons is where I'd like to take this archetype for other classes. The dragons were spread throughout here, from Rise of Shadows to the Descent of Dragons, which was followed. Kind of gave that whole push throughout the entire expansions, and this is more of a setup for certain things. If they wanted to include twists with multiple different types of dragon archetypes, they could do something like this. I personally think it is, yes, quite strong, but it's not the first time we've kind of had something that discovers at a requirement, and this might be a really strong card for its time, but it's very fitting. It's a Witch Doctor. 1 mana 2/1. We've had Witch Doctors at 1 mana 2/1, and it's a very, you know, specific type of archetype. You have to discover a spell. If it becomes too strong, I do think you could probably make it a 1 mana 1/1, lessen the aggression, discover a spell. But I do think this card is just my personal fave, and I would like to see a buff to Fire Tree Witch Doctor. Belligerent Gnome, again, is probably more of an arena card, going from a 1/4 to a 1/5. I think nowadays, in today's term, with something as simple as a 2 mana 1/5, we could definitely see, and its Battlecry definitely does scream arena worthy, where if your opponent has 2 or more minions, gain +1 attack. So now you played a 2 mana 2/5 taunt minion that normally would be a 3 mana card as a 2 mana card. And yeah, I think it's a very good pick for arena. and that's something you could possibly see just kind of included if you happen to get it in your rolls. Arena Fanatic going from a 4 mana 2/3 to a 3 mana 2/2. The idea and concept is that before you wouldn't think this as a good card because, oh well, Paladin had the 2 mana 1/1 that gives all your minions in your hand +1/+1. This card cannot be that. Well, it kind of can, because Paladin now has it as a 2 mana 2/2 that gives +1/+1 to all minions in your hand. So when you think about this, this is just a neutral, weaker variant than the Paladin variant. It's like, if you're going to be playing Paladin, you're not going to be running Arena Fanatic, you're going to be playing the 2 mana 2/2. It's 1 mana cheaper. Are you crazy? And then on top of that, if you're playing Paladin, you're not going to be playing this as a secondary, because you have the 3 mana 2/2 that draws you a minion and then gives your minions +1/+1. So there is a power creep to this, and needless to say though, that if you are playing other decks, or maybe if you're wanting to play Hyreek, for example, you have the option to play it without it feeling too bad, and it kind of pushes you into a hand buff archetype. And it definitely helps with overkill, and I think it's a good activator in that sense. Speaking of overkill, we have Sightless Ranger, 5 mana, going from a 5 mana 3/4 with a 5 mana 4/5, and there is also a change on the overkill where you could see that it actually has summon 2 1/1 bats with rush. Before, they didn't have rush, and it kind of screams to me, again, bats are very rushy type. This card already alone had rush, so it would be kind of cool, you know, giving it a +1/+1. A 5 mana 4/5 rush isn't too bad, and then summoning a good amount of stats after that that you can kind of pinpoint those to certain things can very much put the board in your favor. It is a very strong card, but I do think, you know, again, we're trying to up the overkill advantage here, and trying to encourage that. If it happens to be too much, maybe you go a little bit weaker on the stats, make it a 3/5 instead of a 4/5. But I would very much like to keep the bats with rush, as that is the huge payoff for having the overkill effect. Another great arena card in my opinion. I don't think it would be played necessarily in standard, but it could be put in some meme decks. I'd definitely run it in some meme decks. All right, and lastly, we have some bigger cards here, and of course there are more cards that you could definitely buff, but this is the last of the bunch. Undasta, going from a 9 mana to an 8 mana. I do think there might not be too much trouble in something like this, and again, it's more to encourage the overkill effect, summoning a beast from your hand and just kind of rolling with it. If it happens to be too much, maybe you could kind of alternate it. I do have a second balance that I wanted to do, is make it a 9 mana 7/7 and that summons a beast from your deck, which could be a little bit more useful. It doesn't put things from your hand. It really does depend, but there are multiple ways you can go about buffing Undasta. But however, he is a very simple legendary, and of course simple legendaries can make things very complicated when you're trying to kind of do something that kind of puts you ahead in the game. So you'd have to be very careful with something like this, because you could very much summon a 15/15, 16/16 King Crush where you're just dead. There are shenanigans that Hunter could do, so I can imagine that this could be a problematic card buffing. Crowd Roaster, however, I do believe is a very worthwhile buff, and it is getting quite a substantial one, going from a 7 mana 7/4 to a 7 mana 7/7. And the reasoning for this is, well, 7s look nice on this card, doesn't it? 7 mana 7/7 dragon. If you have a dragon, deal 7 damage to it. It's kind of fitting. You just get all jackpot 7s there. And yeah, I think it's rather cool. Like, seeing it in arena would definitely be really good. I think a lot of people would complain about it. It's possible. I do agree, it is very on the strong side, but more so in standard, you could probably see this be pushed into somewhat of a specific dragon archetype. Like, again, we're talking like warrior, other deck archetypes. If you wanted to introduce them in wild, you have options. If you happen to get this card randomly from a dragon generation, well, now it's worse, and it's actually a playable card. And yeah, I do think it's quite nice. But that's going to be it for the video, everyone. Let me know what you guys think. Did you like the video? What cards did you like about it? And what cards would you include in the buff? Well, please let me know in the comments. I'm always reading the comments down below. But as always, thanks for watching.